Welcome also to everybody that's online. My name is Susie Jones. I'm co-founder and CEO of cybersecurity. We're also long-term residents of Stone and Chalk. We've been part of the Stone and Chalk family for over 4 years now. So really pleased to be running this session for cybersecurity for founders today. There's a few things to run through today. So this is a little bit different to our original workshop that we had planned on running, but I'll run through, and some of this is because of some of the very public breaches that have occurred in the last couple of months. I want to take a bit of time to run through what that has changed pretty much overnight in terms of governance and procurement expectations through some of the large corporations that we work with, and government indications that we're getting from government departments as well. So I'll run through introductions. I'll run through what the Optus and the current cyber crisis really is meaning for change along the way. And then I'll give an overview of what the cybersecurity assurance process actually looks like from within a large corporate. Being a startup founder, if you haven't worked in a security team or procurement team within a large corporate, the whole process can feel pretty opaque. So I'll run through the typical assurance process and some of the big problems with the typical assurance process that you will all be hitting if you are going after large government and corporate businesses. You'll then actually all have access to our Cinch Nailing Cyber Compliance Cyber Fitness program. For those of you in the room, you might not want to sign up on your phone. It's not the best experience on a phone, but you'll have access to be able to go online and sign up and work through that process. And I'll take you through what that can look like in terms of helping you as a startup to actually start closing off some of these gaps that many of the corporates and government departments are looking for. For those online, we'll help get you onboarded as well and get that done, and then wrap up and feedback. For those of you in the room, if you have questions, just raise your hand. Happy to answer it throughout the time. No need to try and remember it to the end because we all know that's not going to happen after an hour and a half. For those of you online, you can submit the questions. I think it's via Slido. So you can submit the questions. If they can be answered quickly there, they will do. Also, for those of you that do sign up to the platform, once you're actually signed up, you can use the chat box in the bottom of the platform. And we've got a couple of our team members on standby, literally watching this live feed, waiting for me to get people on board. So they'll be able to answer questions along the way. So a little bit about Cinch and why I'm the one that's standing up here. So we started in anger back in 2018, and we are wholly and solely small business focused. So that obviously includes startups in the early stage. We built our platform and our solutions for everything from a sole trader up. This is completely unique in terms of the cybersecurity industry. Despite the fact that 97% of businesses across the globe have fewer than 20 staff, 99% of the cybersecurity industry is serving that top 3%. So we've built our platform really with the people at the heart of small businesses in mind. We talk about cyber fitness rather than cybersecurity. This really helps people to realize that when it comes to building up cyber fitness, it's just like physical fitness. You can't go to the gym for every day for a week, smash yourself crazy and say, I'm physically fit for the rest of my life. It's something that you need to gradually build up over time, and it's something that you then need to maintain over time. That's exactly the same when it comes to cybersecurity and cyber fitness. We now have over 900 businesses using our platform as well. So we have a lot of experience in working with some of the smallest companies around this country. We are now expanding internationally. And last week, just a little bit of a plug for me, last week we won the Cybersecurity Australian Technologies competition, which was a pretty big win for us. We're on the up. So, Optus breach, what happened? Why is everyone freaking out? And whilst I say Optus breach, there's also, naturally, there's Medibank, there's AHM, there's all of the others that have come about over the last couple of months. There was a question that I was asked a few weeks back about, are the number of attacks and successful incidents actually on the rise, or is it just that now it's getting media attention and it's top of mind? My response to that is that it's the wrong question to ask. The reality is that the cyber criminals out there are some of the best collaborators in the world. They have more resources, they have infinite time, and they have the skills to just keep on attacking. And none of us have those same resources, time, or skills. So whether or not it's on the increase or not, the simple fact is at the moment, the baddies actually outstrip the number of goodies. So now's the time to act. And whether or not it's happening more often doesn't really make a difference, because these days it's happening more often than what we ever really want to be seeing. But what the Optus attack has really shown us, and then Medibank afterwards, is that the expectations, particularly of consumers, have completely overnight outstripped the expectations and the obligations within legislation. So prior to August this year, we were still in a situation where, particularly in Australia, we've got a certain apathy towards handing over our data, our personal information. We just generally had trust that people were going to do the right thing. And with Optus, quickly followed by Medibank, that changed overnight. So we work with a large group of mortgage broking franchises, And they went from being mortgage brokers for 20 years, never having had a single question from their customers about what do you do to protect my data, where do you store it, etc., to all of a sudden every single one of their active deals, they were getting questions about, hold on, I'm giving you all of my financial information, my identity information. How can I trust you? So it's completely changed consumer perceptions. This is a really great solution for everybody in here and can really help you to understand, have your details been caught up, not just in Optus or Medibank, but any other data breach that's out there. So this is a service that's run by an Australian cybersecurity researcher, Troy Hunt. He lives out of Queensland. It's called haveibeenpwned.com. What this does is he basically aggregates the information of Australian and New Zealand citizens that have had their personal, whether it be their passwords, their emails, their phone numbers compromised, puts it in there. So you can actually log onto this website, put in your phone number or put in your email address and see just how many data breaches have your information come up with. It can be a pretty confronting thing to see for the first time. This was actually the very first seed of Cinch back when my co-founder himself stumbled across this website and found, I think had shown up in something like 6 data breaches back then, and he had no idea. So whilst many people now are having that experience with Optus or Medibank for the first time, even if you're not caught up in those breaches, jump onto this website. I can pretty much guarantee all of you will have shown up in at least one breach, and it can be a pretty confronting feeling to have. So in terms of what happened at Optus, these are very high level, but essentially Optus had been collecting data for a whole stack of different reasons. So there was obviously service delivery, there was regulation, there was fraud prevention, and then there was all sorts of other reasons why they'd been collecting data and storing it for a long time and not doing anything about it. This is one of the big conversations that we've heard over the last couple of months, is all of these organizations have never really thought about the destruction of data or removing data, particularly organizations that have gone through several growth cycles over the years. They might have updated their systems, they might have changed their technology that they have, but they still have these legacy, whether it be servers or wherever else, where there's this honeypot of information sitting there that they've never really thought about how should we be destroying that and removing it. So that's really changing the perspective on many things. How did the data leak? It's pretty simple. I know they came out and said it was a sophisticated attack right at the start. It wasn't a sophisticated attack. Somebody connected the customer database to a testing site that had internet access and published it, essentially. Simple mistake. They obviously didn't follow their own procedures that they would have in place, and just goes to show that Optus, that does have sophisticated processes in place and governance systems, if they are able to make a simple mistake like that, then it's fair to say any of our organisations that are not the size of Optus has the ability to do that. What's happened to Optus since? So they've come out and said that they're provisioning, putting aside, I think, about 150 million in direct response expenses that they're incurring. So far, they've lost 10%, and potentially looking at the future of Optus, there's some big questions there around the position that they have amongst telecommunications across Australia. Can you imagine losing 10% of the number of customers that Optus has in 2 months? That's pretty extraordinary. What went wrong? Basically, somebody stumbled upon it, stole it. The simple fact is that the person that did that, even though they stumbled across complete just repository of information that had been published, they still knew that what they were doing was illegal to actually access, then download, let alone then distribute and release that data. So the actual bad guys in this are definitely the cyber criminals. I know it can, particularly if you are personally affected by the breaches that are going on, I know you can feel a certain amount of anger towards the corporations at the start of it. Simple fact is, any of us could make this mistake. And so it's really about trying to stay ahead of that problem and being intentional about your security. So what does all of this mean, whether it be Optus or Medibank or any of the rest? So there's going to be more scams with and without the data. The simple fact is that now cyber criminals are creating ransomware as a service to send out there. They have entire teams of people that are doing very targeted attacks. There's going to be more data releases in the future. There's going to be higher client expectations, like what I was talking about before around consumer expectations around data protection. But not just consumer, we're already seeing a switch to even further risk aversion within large government departments as well as large corporates as well, because none of them want to be the next Optus, particularly some of the commentary that's come from government about changing the fines for losses. When you start talking to the likes of an Optus or a Telstra and saying, if you make a mistake in the future and lose Australians' data, you can be up for 30% of your turnover, then there is no, that completely stops their ability to be able to own their own risk. So it completely changes the procurement processes and makes it even harder for startups to be able to get into one of these large corporates. There's obviously going to be more legislative changes, not just around data and privacy. There's now talk about making ransomware payments illegal. If you really want to hear my thoughts on that, I can tell you another time, but it's going to slow everything down. Everybody is going to be asking more questions. Everybody's going to have new processes that they're trying to follow within their own organizations, and it's going to result in massive data inaccuracies. Things like the Victorian government, Vic Roads, talking about when they were reissuing driver's licenses, they're just going to add a number at the end for those people that were victims of Optus breach. That sounds great and sounds like a solution, but what about all of those systems and technologies around the country that use to verify driver's license numbers that are hard-coded in to only accept 9 digits? How are they now going to accept 10? So you're going to have all of these corporations that are having to completely change the way they configure their processes, their systems, their technologies because of simple decisions that seem so simple. Just add an extra number because that way everybody will still remember their driver's license number. That's great, but half the banks won't be able to accept it as identity now. So there's going to be lots of data inaccuracies that come from this sort of stuff. Steps to take, and this is just covering off how to not be the next Optus. First one, treat personal information as toxic. When it comes to your business, it should be considered a hazard. Every piece of personal information that you collect from your customers, from your employees, for everybody, treat it as toxic, and then take stock of that data that you handle. Think about where are you storing it, and not just where does it go, but which technologies, what is the pathway that it takes from the moment it comes into your business to the eventual place that you store it? So don't just think about that repository at the end and how do I protect that? How do I manage access? How do I see what's going on? But if you're collecting things from, say, a form on your website, where does that go? How is that actually transmitted from one area to the other? And what protections do you have on that transmission? Think about if customers are emailing you things and then you add it into your CRM. What do you do with the email that still has all of the same personal information? So take stock of where you have. Stop storing sensitive data that you don't need. Just stop it. One example that we use, and it's pretty relevant considering some of the breaches in the last little bit, is for any of you, have you ever rented a house? Who's ever rented? How many of you have been horrified by the data that the property manager expects you to hand over on your personal information? How many of you have confidence that real estate agent has the right processes in place to protect that data? Yeah, absolutely no one. This is the thing, is that real estate agents, particularly for rental, there is no legal reason why they need to have a copy of your driver's license, like a photocopy, an email storage, whatever it is. There is no legal reason why they have to have that. There is a legal obligation for them to verify your identity. That means that they can have a bit of paper or a checkbox on a system to say, yes, I have verified the identity. I have actually checked that these documents are that person. That doesn't mean that they need to store a copy of that driver's license. It doesn't mean they need to store a copy of your passport. And these are the kinds of changes in procedures that everybody should be thinking about, is what data do you have that is toxic? Where are you storing it? And what do I actually need to be able to do what I need to do with it? And anything else, get rid of. Increase security around collection, storage, and access to personal information. So think intentionally about what information are you collecting, where it is, what is the system that it's coming into, what protections do you have in place there? When you think about where you're storing it, what access controls do you have in place? Who in your business can actually access that data, and do they need to? And if they don't, remove the access. It's nothing personal. It doesn't need to feel like a punishment, but if they don't need it, don't let them near it. And then setting clear expectations with staff and clients. This one's a really interesting one from a startup perspective. We work with a number of startups and scale-ups now that have been working for a little while with us to improve their security and improve their governance around security generally. And they're doing a fair bit in terms of training their staff. They're doing phishing simulations. They're doing the right things in terms of setting a security culture. But there's been a couple of them that have had unintentional breaches of policy, which could have, if in the worst case scenario, could have led to a really big problem. And they're saying, how do I actually manage this with a breach? At what point does this become a first warning situation? At what point does it become a final warning situation? So thinking about actually how are you going to handle the flip side of all of this in terms of setting expectations with staff and clients can be really important, because if you're setting the expectations with staff so that they know that even an unintentional breach is going to result in a warning, because that could actually compromise your customer basically relationships, then that can change the behavior and make sure that they're a lot more intentional in terms of following the procedures that you put in place. And position yourself as more trustworthy. This actually also presents this whole situation in the cyber crisis that we're in right now. It presents a really fabulous opportunity for small, innovative companies to be able to use investment into security as a growth tool. Actually being able to say right from the start that we are a small company, that we have from day one or from very early on have been intentional about security. We have policies, we have procedures, we understand the information that we have data destruction policies in place, so we only keep the data that we need to have. That sort of thing can be really powerful message to some big customers along the way. So actually thinking about not just the time it's going to take or potentially any expense that it's going to take from running your business into security, but seeing that as well, this can be another differentiator for our startup, can be a really powerful tool. In terms of supply chains, what does all of this mean for supply chains? Aside from pandemics and natural disasters, cyber incidents are one of very few that have the potential to bring an entire supply chain to a full stop, a dead stop. We saw that happen last year with Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident. What happened in that incident is Colonial Pipeline, so one of the biggest gas or petrol distributors in the United States, their accounting system fell victim to ransomware, was all locked up. So because they couldn't invoice all of the petrol stations that they would usually send and distribute petrol to, they couldn't invoice them, so they just stopped delivering. Basically, that they just stopped. And this is what we saw, the footage of Americans at gas pumps with garbage bags that they were filling up with petrol just to try and make sure that they had enough petrol to continue to survive. There was some pretty harrowing footage coming out of the States from that. And these kind of incidents, whilst that was the biggest company at the top end of that pipeline that came undone, large enterprises in particular are very, very aware that they're very small, critical suppliers in their supply chains can have the same potential to bring everything unstuck. So particularly for those of you that are working on really valuable, innovative tech that's going to replace something that has been in a critical, whether it be a critical part of a solution for a large corporate or working with critical data, there is now more and more expectations around who are they actually going to work with. We're working with a number of small businesses. These businesses, they're field workers. They work out in the middle of nowhere, climbing poles and doing all sorts of stuff. The only thing they use a computer for is to be able to look up where the pole is and weather conditions and stuff like that. But they're now being held to the same standards as an IBM serving that large customer. So it's about, there's no sense of proportionality anymore in terms of the expectations. The expectations are up here. Simple as that. They're also getting asked more and more questions. So boardrooms over the last 2 months since Optus, oh lordy. First of all, we're finding out just how unprepared most directors are in this country, in particular when it comes to cyber incidents. There's a very small proportion of directors around this country that actually have any direct cybersecurity expertise or even experience, knowledge. And so that means that executives are now getting asked some pretty pointed questions from people that don't really know what they're asking. And so you're having to really manage board expectations, answer questions that you've never been asked before. And as a startup, that can be really quite confronting as well. And for those large corporates, that means that all of those questions, no matter how ludicrous, are flowing down to all of their suppliers. So you're going to, if you're working with large corporates and government departments, you're going to be finding, frankly, that you're spending more and more time kind of wasting on these silly questions that come down the pipeline, but you just need to know that's how it's going to be for quite some time. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And it's not going to change anytime soon because there simply are more threats. The threats are bigger with the reliance that we all have on technology being so high these days. All of us are digital businesses, right? None of us are analog businesses anymore. That means simply that there are more and more cyber threats out there. Any questions before I actually go into the process from in the room? Any questions I need to answer from online? Nope. Excellent. I'm just going to keep going. I love talking about this shit. Feel free to jump in if you've got anything along the way. So this is a typical supply chain assurance process. You're going to hear from the tone in my voice that I'm not a massive fan of this whole process. I've seen it in action. I've been the victim on the other end of having to respond to it. But this is what we're facing into when we're trying to sell to the government and corporates. So first of all, the business chooses a supplier and submits it for approval. So when I say the business, I'm talking about not the cybersecurity team. I'm talking about whoever it is within a large corporate or government department that you're selling to, whoever is that business buyer that you're talking to. So they choose a supplier, they submit it for approval. Often this is after months and months of negotiating. All of you would know what it's like working in an enterprise sales cycle at some point. It takes a long time to get to the point where anything gets submitted for approval, but that's just when the fun really starts. There are limited opportunities for existing suppliers to go through this process, particularly for large corporates that have been around for a long time. You think about the backlog of suppliers that have been supplying to them for 10, 20, 30 years, a lot of them are in old, outdated contracts that basically says that the large corporate doesn't even have the ability to ask about security. But in the face of all of these new expectations, you're now going to be seeing these really long-standing relationships being put to the challenge and being given a new contract and saying, now we can't afford to not ask this. We're going to have to break contract and sign a new one and put you through this whole process. Even if your existing customers are onboarded, expect these questions to be coming down the pipeline. The next stage is the supplier is tiered according to criticality criteria. So tiering methods can be really flawed. I've seen some that have 7 different tiers, which to me just seems completely ludicrous. Most of them have 3 or 4 tiers, but basically you will have tier 1 will be the absolute most critical. So they will either be ones where you have direct connectivity into their technology environment. If you're actually going to be integrated into their systems, you're automatically tier 1, which means you get the white glove experience. Tier 2 will be those that don't have direct integration usually, but are very critical to operations. If you fail to work, you're going to cause them a really bad day. And then it goes down from there. Those of you that are collecting or storing customer information or accessing customer information, you're now going to be tier 1 no matter what. And then they're often blind to aggregated risks. So if you think about at Australia Post, for instance, where I used to work, we had over 4,000 suppliers just on the list of suppliers that we knew about, because there's always that lovely little shadow IT in the background of people signing up to stuff using corporate credit cards as well. So we had thousands and thousands of suppliers. And on an individual basis, we would put them through the supplier assurance process, but we never had a system to be able to step back and see all of our suppliers are missing this key control, or all of our suppliers 70% of our suppliers are actually using AWS. What if there's an AWS issue? So that aggregated risk issue, most corporations are still blind to it, but they are very uncomfortable that they are blind to it. So you're going to see innovation in that space. The supplier is then sent an assurance questionnaire based on their tier. How many of you in this room have ever received a security assurance questionnaire? Yeah, how fun was it? So these questionnaires, usually they are drafted by a security assurance professional within their cybersecurity team. It will be a combination of controls that form part of, whether it be IRAP or ISO 27001. Sometimes they like to go off the ones over in the States. They might be SOC 2 compliance. There's all sorts of ones. They munge it all together. Sometimes it'll be based off the security assurance questionnaire that their old boss at their last organization used that they quite liked, and then they'll add in their own flavor. So what you end up with is a questionnaire that may as well be written in Latin for starters. So it's certainly no plain language. You don't even know what it's really asking. It will have very little relevance to your actual relationship that you're trying to build with that corporation. They'll be asking lots of questions that are simply irrelevant based on what you're doing, but you're still expected to answer them and still expected to provide evidence. And all of that means that there are inherent data integrity issues. If you're asked to answer a questionnaire and you have to give an answer to get that business, and you don't understand what half the questions are, guess what you do? You guess, or you give your best estimate of what the response should be. So that means in aggregate, all of those responses that those corporations are receiving, they can't truly rely on the responses in there. So there's a massive integrity issue in terms of the data integrity. And there's also varying degrees of trust in the answers that you give. The security team then assess the response and either does or doesn't endorse that supplier to come on board. There's often questions arising over who has the authority to approve or deny. In many teams, and I know this from my background, cybersecurity teams get the bad reputation of being the Department of No and that sort of thing, but they're doing it for a pretty good reason. Like, they're the ones that get taken to task when they become the next Optus or the next Medibank. Nobody's looking at the customer service team in those teams and saying this cybersecurity incident was your fault. Everybody looks at the CISO and the security team and says, why did you allow this to happen? So then there's big questions around this. So when it comes to the security assurance process, you really need to get help. If you don't understand the questions that are coming to you, you don't understand how to answer them, you need to get help so that you can provide accurate answers and understand, for those ones that you're not yet able to say yes to, how are you going to position that? Are you going to say, no, we don't do it, and that's it, and just submit the questionnaire and probably not get the business? Or are you going to say, no, however, this is on our roadmap, we're doing this, we're doing that, etc.? So that's overall the assurance process. As you can hear from my tone, I hate it. We're trying to change it, but it's a slow moving feast. The other thing that is coming about more and more often is instead of going through this process, particularly for the smaller end of large corporates, they're simply asking or requiring us to have accreditation. So there's things like ISO 27001. You could have had an assessment done against the ACSC's Essential 8. Mind you, no government department actually passes the maturity levels that are expected of them. But you need to remember, if you're agreeing to something like ISO 27001, the typical cost, even for a very small business to become accredited, runs in the tens and tens of thousands. Most businesses that I've seen that have received a quote to get them ISO 27001 accredited in the last 12 months have been upwards of $50,000. So if you're being asked by a potential customer to become ISO accredited, make sure you're pricing that into it. There are ways to lower the cost, not wanting to sell here, but we have ways to help you get more audit ready. We can't provide you with accreditation, but our solution can get you a lot of the way there. But know that that cost is extensive, but there's also the other cost that is involved, which is time. For most organizations to go from nowhere near ready for an audit to audit ready for ISO 27001 or IRAP government business is at least 12 months runway. If you're going to be putting big opportunities on the back burner for 12 months until you can get that accreditation, that's a big problem. So getting ahead of the issue and starting to work on this stuff sooner rather than later can help you get that next big deal faster.
I was about to ask about IRAP, government associated, but you already said with that, especially if startups are wanting to do government-based business, would you recommend that they look at doing an or aligning with the IRAP framework rather than going to go an assessment and then that assess that extends that question to all other industries as well?
Yeah, look, I think it depends on the ambitions of the startup. So if that startup knows that they have a solution and the best fit customer for them is always going to be government departments of some way, shape or form, then I think they'd be crazy to not be working towards IRAP. There are some government departments now that are using a sort of a cut down version of IRAP called Fit for Risk. When I say a cut down version, it's still horrible, guys. It's still a mess. At the end of the day, for any business that has aspirations of claiming a big part of the government market, particularly if they're the larger government agencies and departments, then they need to be working towards it. If it's more something for local governments, etc., then it may not be a big thing, because local governments, frankly, are in just as bad a position as most small businesses when it comes to their security. For those that are working towards, that have the ambitions of having lots of corporate customers here in Australia, I would be looking more towards ISO 27001 as the standard to go by. For those of you that are looking to expand internationally, you got big issues heading down your way, particularly the States. So many US companies now are requiring you to have SOC 2 accreditation. We haven't gone through SOC 2, but all of the other cyber firms that I know have says it's absolute debacle to get hold of it, even particularly for companies here in Australia that are still based here and not over in the States, but are trying to sell to the States, because there's actually very few auditors here that are accredited to do the accreditation. Be mindful when you're thinking about your international expansion as a startup to be looking at what are those requirements, not just from a general business governance perspective, what are the legalities of selling into new companies, but also countries. Also think about what are the cybersecurity expectations there. We've seen, I think everybody's pretty familiar with the fact that most European countries have been ahead of this curve for quite some time with GDPR and that sort of stuff. But we're now starting to see a bit of fragmentation around Europe and different expectations from country to country, rather than being sort of just the EU perspective. Thank you very much, Brexit. So certainly you need to be thinking about what are the expectations of whatever market it is that you're going for. I think it's fair to say all of us should be expecting not just more businesses to be asking for accreditation, but I think most businesses, most security teams are they're very aware that asking a small business to get ISO accreditation is something that's not going to be a quick task. So if you're an existing supplier to large corporations, I would be reaching out to whoever your contact is and saying, look, we're going to be improving our security. Can you find out from your security team what are the expectations that they're working towards? Are they expecting you to be aligning to NIST or ISO or Essential? What is the framework that they care about? And start working on that. And then you can actually get ahead of all of this issue and show and start to differentiate yourself and say, look, we might be a small supplier to you, but you're a valued customer. We want to make sure that you can continue to trust us into the future. We want to align to what it is you're working on. Now, that might mean that you end up, if you've got half a dozen or a dozen really important clients of yours that you want to work towards, that may mean that you've actually got 3 wanting ISO and 3 wanting Essential 8 and stuff like that. Just start somewhere, build towards that. All of the security standards have overlap between them as well. So don't think that you're going to work on one and then you have to start all over again for the next, because many of the controls that you've already put in place for one will still be ticked off in the next one as well. Yeah.
At this point in time, are there any regulations that are enforced by regulation?
Yes, the new security of critical infrastructure that is coming out. This is something that we're spending a lot of time on at the moment with one of our partners, is building out a cyber fitness program specifically for suppliers working in critical infrastructure. For many of you, if you're not aware, the definition of what is critical infrastructure in this country changed last year with the introduction of the new amended that expanded. So things like particular like hospitals and that sort of thing, that was never considered critical infrastructure in the past. Now it is. So the risk management guidelines that were released, I want to say about a month ago, thereabouts, have just been released out of Home Affairs. And so that's starting to set the expectations from a regulation perspective about what is minimum standards. And they're not small obligations. So if you're a startup that is supplying into an organisation that is captured by SOCI, you need to be thinking about, does that mean you're now captured by SOCI? Because that security of critical infrastructure bill is pretty full on. Right now, really the only privacy obligation that we have on us is if you are captured by the Australian privacy principles. So there are there are some carve-outs in the principles though, so it should mean that many of us in startup land are not yet obligated by it. But you know what? When you actually read the privacy principles, they're pretty good principles to abide by anyway. It's things like, basically, in other words, treat personal information as toxic, make sure you're only collecting what you need to collect in order to provide the service, etc. So they're obligations that are on there. And attached to that, if you are caught up by the privacy principles, then you are caught by the mandatory data breach notification legislation. So if you do have a data breach and you're subject to the privacy principles, then you have to notify the government when you have a data breach. So we're seeing at the moment healthcare and financial services are still the industries that are attacked most often. So if you're a startup in health or medical or finance, which I think in many ways most of us are in some way, shape or form, I'd be starting to think pretty closely about how can you make sure that all of your policies and procedures are aligned to the privacy principles. I think it's fair to say, particularly with some of the rhetoric that's coming out of Minister O'Neill's office right now, we're going to be seeing a lot more legislative changes. So I would be keeping a pretty close eye on what's coming out of Home Affairs. Yeah. Yeah, so government loves IRAP. I don't know why. It's horrible. But they're not going to be getting rid of IRAP anytime soon unless it is replaced by something bigger and bolder and more stringent. I think it's fair to say we're never going to go backwards in terms of the number of expectations that we have. It's only ever going to increase. I know the Australian Cybersecurity Centre are reviewing the Essential 8. They do regular reviews anyway, but there's conversations about whether or not it should be the Essential 26, which is what the whole number was overall. But there's also a lot of conversations about the fact that with Essential 8, particularly when it comes to application whitelisting, the actual directions that the ACSC put out to say to be at level 3 maturity, you must have these things in place. For most small businesses, based on the technology that small businesses use, that's actually impossible. So there's lots of conversations about how do we strike a balance between what is actually practical and effective versus the actual security of the standards. There's a lot of conversations about there, but I don't think, particularly because most of the standards are being driven by political conversations, I can't see anybody being the one that wants to say that they want to reduce the number of security standards. I would be working towards at least Essential 8, sort of level 2, if you can. That will get you through most doors, and then working towards, in the longer term, towards ISO certification. So particularly for businesses that are going overseas, whilst the US is a little bit different, they've got some of their other, they've got CMMC that they're building out and SOC 2, that the expectations are there. If you get ISO accreditation, that's still going to open most doors globally, or at least get you to have a conversation with them so that you can be on the list for consideration, and then you can actually buy yourself time to get those additional accreditations. Yeah. Any other questions in the room? So the challenges on both sides of this, and I really do feel for those that work in corporate security teams as well, because they get to be treated like the bad guys in the business and the Department of No all the time, but they're actually just spending all day, every day trying to stop the worst thing happening. So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. So for the large customers, it means that they've got no visibility of their supply chain truly in aggregate. It's time and resource heavy. When you send out questionnaires that have 900 questions in it or even 100 questions in it, that's all written in tech jargon, quite often they end up turning into a pseudo help desk, just trying to help their suppliers even understand what the questions are asking. So it's really time and resource heavy. Of course, it ends up in inconsistent responses. So how can you rely on it? How can you make decisions based on those? It's point in time only. So all of our security of our businesses will be, the security posture of our businesses will be completely different next week to what it is this week. But you're responding to a single questionnaire at a single point in time. So it means that in even a month's time, they can't really rely on those responses. There's no way to query the data or identify trends within most security teams. There are solutions out there that can help them do that, but they're quite expensive and they're always getting budget for security. For a governance perspective, that's always the first thing to get chopped off the budget. And there's limited options to support businesses who are improving but not quite there yet. Because it is a point in time questionnaire, because most of the time it only gives you a yes, no on the spreadsheet, it can be really hard for a business, a startup who has spent the last 12 months investing into security but hasn't quite got a yes to all of those questions yet, but has plans to get there. I would prefer to work with that company than the company that has all of the answers but has had the same answers for the last 5 years and hasn't been continuing to invest in security. But there's no way for them to be able to judge which one's which at the moment. For small suppliers and startups, difficult to interpret the questionnaires. They really are just not written well at all. Time and resource heavy. So those small field workers that we were talking about before, one of those spent over 100 hours responding to the enterprise security questionnaire that they got sent, and they still failed. And they still don't know why, because it's an enterprise system and they don't provide feedback. Starting again, each and every time you get a new one of these questionnaires, you have to start all over again. It's so frustrating. Limited ability to demonstrate improvement over time, sort of the flip side of what I talked about before. And how do you explain improvement plans for the future when all you're getting is just a spreadsheet with yes or no options? So it can be really challenging on both sides of the coin. Yeah.
In your experience, do sort of powerful customers in the supply chain, are they likely to accept, for example, an ISO certification over a supply questionnaire? So, in other words, would that having that certification bump you up and remove that 100 hours worth of?
Yeah, in my experience, definitely. In my experience, if you do have an ISO accreditation and they're asking questions that are covered off under ISO accreditation, you can just say, yes, last certified under ISO, blah, blah, blah date. And that can really slow down the amount of, really reduce the number of hours you spend responding to those questionnaires. Sometimes it can actually replace the questionnaire altogether. They can say, do you have ISO accreditation? If you say yes, they go tick, and then you move on to the next stage of procurement process. Doesn't happen as often as you would like, but sometimes it does. Overall, that's the positioning, and I know I've taken ages just to set out that position, but I think it's really important to understand why these questions are coming through and what's really driving the changes and the increase in expectations right now, particularly in the wake of these data breaches, because they're only going to continue to increase. I've heard things like from a security supplier assurance team member who right now is saying, I'm not risk accepting anything. So if any supplier hits my desk that doesn't pass what we say is the minimum standard, I'm not approving them, because they don't want to be the ones that loses 30% of their revenue because of a data breach from a supplier. They don't want their signature to be the one on that risk form. And this is the thing, is that they're actually asked to physically sign off to say, yes, I accept this risk that this supplier doesn't meet our minimum standards. In this environment, certainly from now until Christmas, nobody's going to be putting that signature on that page. So it's really important to think about, if you're trying to work with whoever it is that you're selling to and trying to get them to agree to accept less, be aware that there's probably just zero chance of them accepting less right now. So you need to be factoring this into your sales plan and your accreditation plan.
A quick couple of questions. If something's gone through the process and discussion had a roadblock by security that's obtaining, say, IRAP or an ISO accreditation, one that would allow it to proceed, and existing organisations who are already in the supply chains, will they need to start adhering to this, or just the fact that they're an incumbent, will that allow them to proceed?
It's different. It's on a company by company basis. But like those 4 field workers that we've been talking about, they've been working with that large corporate for 20 years. all four of those companies. And yet now they're being asked to go through Cyber GRX, which is built for enterprises to respond to security assurance questions and meet a minimum standard. And they've now had some authorization cut off so that they don't have the same integration into that company because they failed the assessment, and they're being told that potentially their entire contract could be cancelled.
So existing incumbents may have been aware about this, but this is something they're about to face. And
Absolutely.
the same scrutiny that's even new enterprises.
Exactly.
Something you expect to see over the next
Absolutely. And this is where it potentially gives startups an in that you didn't have before if you're ahead of this game. If you're actually building out security, you're building out your library of responses to those questions, you could potentially now have an opportunity to replace an incumbent that you didn't have 12 months ago. Yep. Any other questions before I skip on to the next bit? So what we've done at Cinch is try to, the way I've been describing it recently, my co-founder probably hates this, but we've been trying to democratize the supply chain process. So we've built a platform that is designed for small businesses that don't have time, that have very small budgets, and don't have cybersecurity expertise to be able to manage their cyber risk. That's our bread and butter, what we've been doing since day one. So we've built an entire platform that can help you to actively and intentionally manage your cyber risk. But then on the flip side of that, we recognized that there's this whole, within large corporates and government departments, there's this whole conundrum in terms of them not having aggregated views, not being able to support small businesses to respond to questionnaires, not having no standardization, all of that sort of issues that I spoke about before. And so we've built this platform for the suppliers to be using, but we've actually built a secondary platform that large corporates can use to have all of the actions that are being tracked in the platform then aggregated and reported into a partner portal so they can actually see in aggregate what their small business supply chain cyber risk looks like. And so we're looking to roll that out. But in the meantime, what we've got in our platform is a whole bunch of different compliance focused cybersecurity, or what we call cyber fitness programs, that can help you actually focus on improving the things that matter for accreditation and compliance first. Because whilst our platform at its heart is a cyber risk platform that prioritizes things by the best. What is the best control that you could in place for your technologies right now to reduce your risk? Sometimes you're not thinking about your risk, you're thinking about the big deal and compliance. And so we've built out cyber fitness programs in here that are aligned to that. So there's actually programs aligned and security reports aligned to ISO 27001, so you can start working towards that. There's Essential 8. And then there is this program that you'll all get free access to at the end of this. And for those online can actually sign up to today, in the session, you'll all have free access for a couple of weeks to this program to help you get started on this compliance journey. And just to give a bit more context before anybody signs up, because we are talking security and I've just spent 45 minutes scaring the pants off most of you. So our platform, we don't ask for any information that we don't need in order to be able to advise you of your technology risks and improvement actions. It is hosted on Google Cloud Platform here in Australia. We have pretty significant access controls around that data. It is all stored here in Australia. It's been built by our team here in Australia. Nothing's been outsourced. The only things that are integrated from outside is we do have intercom for customer messaging and that sort of thing, and we use Typeform for our surveys. But otherwise, it is all here and it's hosted within our environment. What this will do, and this is the front page that you see when you sign up. So basically, you sign up for the platform, verify your email address, the usual kind of thing, and you'll log into a screen that looks a little bit like what you see here on the dashboard. Now, most of you will find that the initial number, that cyber fitness number there, will be somewhere between 0 and 3%. Don't be scared. That's because we don't know much about your business yet. Because what this represents is 100% of that cyber fitness donut, of an oxymoron in terms of language there, but that cyber fitness donut equals the cyber risk points that we've allocated to the technology that we know about your business. Now, when you first sign up, all we know is what we can see from the outside in. So we take your domain, we check out your website, automatically we've got a scanner that does this. We see if you've got things like a privacy policy, do you have some of those initial security controls that we would expect to see. We allocate a risk based on the technologies that we see, and then we give you cyber fitness points for any of those security controls that we can see. So if you have a privacy policy, you get a few points. If you do have the padlock and the certificates up to date, then you get a few points, etc. But all of this is going to be based on the technology. Now, when you first sign up, we only know about what we can see from the outside in. So the first activity you're going to be and pointed to within our platform is to tell us about the technology that you actually use in your business. So it's about a 5-minute survey. You go through and it takes you through a virtual walk through your day. So what do you use for accounting? Is it Xero or MyOb or QuickBooks? What do you use as your CRM? Are you a Google house or a Microsoft house, etc.? Do you use Macs or PCs, iPhones or Androids? Takes you through all of that and uses your responses, your initial responses, as a bit of a proxy for your whole organization. And then further down the track, we can catch the other technologies that are used by other people in the business. But it's going to be a pretty good start. Once you complete that first activity, that's going to populate out. So you can see here on it says check out your riskiest technologies. I'm just trying not to trip over the form, but just there. So that's going to allocate more cyber risk points. So after that first activity, if you were say at 3%, you might actually drop down to 2%. But that's only because we don't know about the security controls that you've already put in place for those other technologies. The next activity is a little kind of essential A survey that takes you through and gathers some of those security actions that you put in place. So again, it takes about 5 minutes. There's some things that we get you to go off and check on your computer, like we get you to check, are you running as administrator? And for those of you that might not know why that's a bad thing, if you're running your computer as administrator, if your computer is compromised, if somebody manages to access your computer and you're running as administrator, they can basically do whatever they want to that computer. Whereas if you run a separate account as administrator to what you work on every day, if somebody gains access to it, they're not going to be able to download or install new programs on your computer unless they actually have that administrator password. So it's an extra layer of protection, makes it that bit harder for somebody to gain access. So then after you go through that second 5-minute activity, you'll see the number here should increase. Normally it bumps up to about 4 or 5%, provided you've done the things that we would recommend in that activity. And then you can keep going through the program. So you'll see here, keep working on your goals there on the screen. There'll be a program there called Nailing Cyber Compliance, and that's a program that you can start working through over the next couple of weeks to actually see. So what we've done is we've taken the questions that are most commonly seen in security assurance questionnaires. They all come from the security standards like ISO 27001, etc. We've taken all of those questions, bundled them into groups and stages within a program that kind of make sense together. So things like reviewing your access control, reviewing your storage, reviewing your backup systems, etc. And so you can actually just follow the bouncy ball. So we break down all of the actions and activities. We break it down into 5-minute activities so that it might be, okay, create an incident response plan, which you can do and generate in our platform. That'll be one action. And then it'll be, the next action will be share it with your team so that everybody actually knows what the incident response plan is, where to find it. The next one will apply 12 months down the track, and it'll be, it's time to review your incident response plan and check to see if it's okay. So this really helps to make it so that it's accessible. We all know as startup founders and people working in startups, you never have more than 15 minutes to work on any one thing at a time. Sometimes you might manage to find half an hour or thereabouts. That way, if you find half an hour, you can come in here, you can smash out 5 or 6 actions and know that at least you've done something meaningful to work towards compliance and cybersecurity and cyber fitness into the future.
Do you provide templates into such things as incident response plans, security plans, and also then how you actually respond to such assurance questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the end of the program, there's a final report that you can actually use to print off and say these are all of the controls that we've put in place that'll be in plain language that you can actually share as part of a procurement process. Many businesses actually use it to have conversations also up with their boards, and there's other reports that we have that you can auto generate in your platform to help with some of those other conversations you have. So whilst you guys will gain free access to this over the next couple of weeks, for our premium members, which is still only $400 per business per month, which when you consider most cybersecurity consultants would charge $1,500 a day, $400 a month. If you get a security assurance questionnaire sent to you, you can send it to our team. We map it into our platform, and then you can just print off a report. And more importantly, you can see straight away which questions you're not able to answer yes to yet. And so say you've got 2 weeks to respond to the questionnaire, you've got 2 weeks to get a few more yeses onto that report, and it tells you exactly how to do it. So it can really help to speed up that process. Also, the fact that when you're using a platform like this on a regular basis and maintaining it over time, it means when you do get a questionnaire, you're not having to go back and say, oh shit, are these the things that I said last time, are they still relevant? If you're maintaining it, you already know that it's up to date. And so all you have to think about is what are the extra steps that you need to put in place to stop that. So for everybody online that wants to do this right now, this is the URL you can go to. For those of you here, you can do it on your phone, but to be honest, the experience is a bit crap on the phone. So you might want to just come back to it later, but maybe just take a photo of this, and certainly we can send out the slides. I've got no issue sending out the slides after this as well, but take a photo of this so that you can do it when you get home. For those of you online that you can do this right now, my team are there in the background once you've signed up to the platform to be able to answer questions along the way. And so what I would say for everybody here on the call, these are some of the recommendations that I would suggest suggest you have a look at first of all. So the first one here is this discover your cyber risks. So this is the first stage of the Nailing Cyber Compliance Cyber Fitness program that's in there. So this would be about documenting the key technologies and then giving your business a cyber fitness checkup. So they're those two exercises that I spoke about before, because really until we understand what technologies you use and what you've already done, we can't give you prioritized advice. So it's the first step, naturally. And then you'll find going through the stages, some of them will have a stack of actions for you to do. Some of them will only have a few, but that's because it is unique to the technologies that you use in your business. So for those of you that use stack of different tech and cloud platforms and stuff like that, there's going to be more recommendations because frankly, your cyber risk is bigger. For those of you that have a pretty small tech stack and keep it pretty tight, some of those stages you're only going to have a couple in there. So the second stage there in the program is control access to your systems. So this is where we recommend that you review your team's access levels for, and I've said here on the slide, insert tech here. So this is reviewing access for each and every different tech that you have. So here within Cinch, it drives our devs pretty crazy sometimes because we've got pretty tight access controls. There's only one person in our organization, which is my co-founder and CTO, that can actually push things to prod. But that's for a very good reason. That at the end of the day, our entire business is about security. We've got very tight access controls. We've also got really tight joiner and leaver access controls in place so that when somebody leaves our organization, we can instantly cut off, not instantly, but pretty damn quick, cut off access to any of the systems they have. Plus, we know which systems that they have access to. How many of you could say for your organizations that you know for each and every staff member which systems they have access to? I know I do. But they're the sort of things like if you have, so I've been talking about cyber criminals and hackers and all of that sort of stuff today. Malicious insiders and disgruntled employees can cause just as much, if not much more havoc than any Russian ransomware group that's attacking Medibank right now. So if you have staff, if you're going through a cycle where you might be needing to let staff go, before you do that, intentionally think about how are you going to cut their access and how are you going to know what it is, what systems they do and don't have access to. So this step is a really important one and is fundamental to do on a pretty regular basis because sometimes things happen, right? Somebody will go on leave, and particularly within a startup, everybody wears so many different hats. So if somebody goes on leave, 2 weeks annual leave at some point, most of the time there's going to be some system that you're going to need, that they have access to, that you're going to need them to give access to somebody else for those couple of weeks. But then what happens a month later when they still have access to it? And then what happens 6 months later when 3 other people have gone on leave and that one person now has access to 4 different systems that they shouldn't necessarily have? So doing this for each and every one of your technologies that you use and doing it on a regular basis, even if it's just once every 3 months, can be really fundamental. Seeing some knowing smiles here. Cool. Awesome. So locking down your IT network. So enabling logging in Microsoft 365 so you can figure out what went wrong and enabling logging in all of the different technologies you use. One of the things that's really hard when you're responding to an incident is if you haven't turned on audit logs. And audit logs, for some unknown reason, are not automatically on for most technologies that you use. I don't know why. They should just be mandatory. They should just be on and part of it. But for some reason, many organizations think that security is a nice to have and try and charge for it. And so most of the time, audit logging is not enabled. So actually going through and enabling it, not just for Microsoft 365 that I say on here, but for all of the other systems that you have, so that when you have an incident, you can actually see what went wrong, when did it go wrong, what happened, so that you can contain that incident quickly. The next stage is all about securing your devices. So I've just said here, the example is make sure your team is using the latest operating system, whether it be on their phone, on their laptops, on their devices and tablets, making sure that they're actually updating their systems as soon as new patches come out. I know back before I worked in security, I used to have competitions with my friends as to how many of those little red bubbles on my early iPhone I had that had updates ready, and we'd have competitions as to who could have the highest number. Pretty bad, but obviously I've reviewed my, and so now I've enabled automatic updates on everything. It can be a bit annoying sometimes when I come back in the morning and I see that my phone is updated and all of a sudden it wants my passcode and I've got to re-log into things and all the rest of it. But at least it means that I know I've always got the most up-to-date software. So actually checking that yourself and your team are using the latest operating system is really important. Backups, understanding best practice of backup management. Whatever it is, whatever systems it is that you use, making sure that you have appropriate backup. Now, if it's cloud, understanding how you would recover your data if there was an incident can be really important. So making sure that you actually understand the best practice of the whole backup management can be really important, because it's not just about having a backup and set and forget, particularly those of you that don't have cloud services for everything, that actually might have your own server for whatever reason. We had, in the early days of Cinch, we had a customer that came to us. They were about to transition over to cloud, but they had an incident before they joined us. They'd had an incident where they'd lost a stack of their data. Now, they thought they had really good backups in place. They'd set it up for daily backups and it should have all been fine. They hadn't tested it, and turns out that the backups that they set up 5 years ago had actually stopped working 3 years ago. So doesn't do much if you don't test it. You don't know how to actually recover it. Preparing for when things go wrong, creating an incident response plan. So within our platform, you can actually automatically generate this. You can download it either as a PDF or as a Word document if you want to be able to make other changes and put your font and your logo and that sort of stuff on there. But the absolute worst time to be making a plan on how to respond to an incident is when you're responding to an incident. Not knowing who to call can be absolutely harrowing. Again, it was a big part of the reason why Cinch exists. Adam and I, back in our days of Australia Post, were working on a project in Post that was working with ID Care. So ID Care is a not-for-profit out of Queensland that supports Australian and New Zealand citizens that have had a data identity theft incident. So we were working with ID Care to see if we could create a response service for small businesses, because ID Care works on a citizen level, but they were getting more and more requests for help from small businesses. So we were working on this project within Post. And we, as part of the early stage of that project, we were interviewing small business owners that had actually had a data breach and listening to what that experience was like. It was the absolute worst day of their lives that day, because for small business owners, and founders are no different, right? Our company is our identity. There is no difference between Susie Jones, who lives in Pakenham, and Susie Jones, co-founder and CEO of Cinch. It's one and the same. And that is the same for small businesses right across this country. So when they have a cyber incident, or particularly a data breach, it's felt very personally. And we learned a few things as part of that project. We learned, first of all, that small businesses are completely ignored by the cybersecurity incident, particularly back then. Cinch didn't exist, and some of the other partners that we now work with didn't exist. So it was virtually nothing out there to have helped them avoid that incident in the first place. Secondly, we helped Australia Post realise they don't want to be a security firm, so the project got shut down. But thirdly, that was when we learned just how personal it is, and that having a simple thing like a printed out document that told them with phone numbers of people that they could call in that time of crisis would have helped them so much. So creating an incident response plan is really critical. And then building a cyberfit team. So creating a cybersecurity checklist for new starters. Sorry, my phone's ringing. I thought I had that on Do Not Disturb. So creating a cybersecurity checklist for new starters. So actually being intentional about setting that culture from the very, very first day that a new starter joins with you. So that can be things like talking about the access controls and why they're only going to have access to some systems, and why they're going to receive phishing simulation emails every month, and why they're asked to read and then sign off on an information security policy. Creating that culture from right at the start and being able to create a cybersecurity checklist so that you can take them all through that as part of that journey can be really valuable, and can just help to pretty quickly shift the entire culture of your startup to being one that is just much more intentional about security. And then also can help them all to then start talking about when they're at, I was going to say when they're at barbecues, but nobody ever does it anymore post-COVID. But when they are anywhere where they are talking to new people about their organization, they can actually say with pride, all of them will be able to say with pride, oh, take security really seriously. I know I have to do this every month and that every month and stuff like that. And it can really just change the whole sort of vernacular of your startup. Now, this is a little bit different to usual, because usually I would have everybody in a room with their laptops and going through it. And I'm hoping everybody online is having the opportunity to do that. For those of you online that have any questions around the tech and what they're using in there, as I mentioned, I've got some of my team there answering questions that you put into the chat box. For all of you, if you guys sign up later on when you get back to your desks or whatever, the team will still be there. They're our customer success team, so they'll be there. So answering any of the questions that you have along the way. But if there are any other questions here, either in the room or even that's put into Slido from those virtually that want to talk about about any of what I've discussed today, please feel free. You've still got me for a fair bit of time. I think I've done this pretty quick actually. So, 20 minutes. Any other questions? Any experiences that anybody wants to share around any of the wonders of procurement? Yep.
It's a massive part of cybersecurity, which really gets over a lot is disgruntled employees, which you brought up, which I'm happy you did. Is there, of course, there's laws and regulations, but as a business owner yourself, what procedures do you put in place apart from the end when you restrict access and everything like that? Is there anything else that you to make sure everyone does?
Yeah, so we take everyone through the induction training and refreshers of what our policies are and why. We have weekly meetings on a Monday morning to talk through what's going on in the world of cybersecurity. We usually talk about the latest cyber news, but that can be an early trigger for us to understand if everybody's not on the same page. We also, on a daily basis, this is just part of our regular culture, and it didn't start off being a control from a security perspective, but it certainly is in hindsight. So our team work 100% remotely. So we have a daily stand-up call at 10 a.m. every day, and we start that call by asking everybody what is their number from 1 to 10. And it helps us in a few different ways. We started it during Melbourne lockdowns just to see who was really struggling from a mental health perspective, but it can also help us if we have a staff member that's trending 4 to 5 every day for a few weeks. Frankly, if they did it every day for 3 days, we'd be reaching out to them and making sure that they've got the support and we could understand what's going on. Now, it's easy for me to say that we're still a relatively small team right now, but some of those controls and being intentional about understanding where people's heads are from a security perspective, not just from a people management and culture perspective, can be really valuable. As I say, we've got checklists for a bunch of things for when people join, when people leave. We remind them of their obligations pretty regularly. Being a security firm, it's a little bit easier for us to do that because we're constantly talking about, okay, what's in the news? Is that relevant for our small business customers? If it is, what's the advice that we can give? Could that happen at Cinch? That conversation happens on a pretty regular basis for us because we're a security firm. But for those of you that are running startups that are not security focused, try and find a way to bring that into more of your regular conversations. Have any of you seen the latest Teams phishing email? I heard about that this morning. Apparently there's one doing the rounds that's really good and is getting a lot of people caught unawares. So even things like if you have Slack channels for your teams, having one in there for team members to be able to post a screenshot of the dodgy emails they have so that the whole team sees it and knows not to click on it, that can be really powerful.
And then the screenshots can also go the other way. Let's say for a disgruntled employee, you do remove the access once it's finished. Let's say he's been disgruntled for the last month, 2 months, 3 months. And so he starts rating like his happiness level or his wellness level at a 10, going by until 6 months later, and the company's screwed with screenshots and screen records. And even there's a lot of cases of people getting other phones and taking pictures of screens. If there was a technology to stop that, would you implement it?
Potentially. I figured that was where you're going. I'm not about to stand up here and say I'm buying it, but certainly interested to hear about it for sure. Yeah. Any other? Yeah.
As part of the assessment process, you link through to external services. What kind of data access and connections do you maintain as a service?
Yeah, so we don't use any agents. Nothing is on your system. All of it is web-based. So at no point do we take control of your system at all. So the control is always within yours. We do have product partnerships with products such as password managers. So obviously they manage your passwords as a vault, phishing simulation services, although that's just sending it to your email, etc. We're not that kind of security firm that has those sort of integrations or is introducing new technologies into your business. It's all web-based. Any questions on?
I have a bit of a comment. I was really pleased to hear you talking at the start about viewing security as a growth tool.
Yeah.
Because on Monday when we were launching, there was a lot of talk around cybersecurity, the costs of it, how they were going to be increasing, everybody needs to be spending more. And I think that it's really important for businesses like Cinch and other people involved to be able to understand the potential of that, what that investment might actually return on. The return on that investment, for example, $400 a month is a drop in the ocean in terms of what will happen if you're able to bring on new customers. I think it's a really nice lens to be looking at security like that today.
Yeah, absolutely. I love having that conversation with our customers that are starting to get these questionnaires and starting to hit these barriers and then come to us. They'll book in a coaching call with our team. We'll talk through the questions and what the opportunity is. And by the time they get to the end of the call, they're like, okay, so we know we need to put in better email filtering, but that's fine because we're doing that for a contract that's a 6-figure contract. So of course I'll spend 10 grand or whatever it is to put in email filtering. So it's completely changing the lens of all of it. I think the days are gone when we're talking about the shifts and changes that have happened even just in the last couple of months. 6 to 12 months ago, there used to be this idea that you would take an IT budget of a company And as long as you were spending about 3% of it on security, then that was right. And I think certainly many times over the last 3 weeks, I've heard CISOs talking about the fact that they're now for the first time ever being able to have conversations at the board level as to why those budgets should be completely separate. There is absolutely no correlation between how much you spend on IT and how much you should spend on security, because security is not IT. It is based on technology. The risk is based on technology, but it's people, it's processes, technology, all of these controls, and that it has no correlation to how much you pay for your AWS. Like, it just doesn't. Any questions from online? No? Oh, awesome. Thanks. Cool. If there's no other questions, I just wanted to last of all, just call out the amazing sponsors for Oz Cyber and Stone and Chalk for all of Cyber Week: ASA, Snare, CyberMerc and CyberAware. CyberMerc, by the way, a few years ago, I went to Israel on a trip at very early days in Cinch and met one of the founders of CyberMerc. It's probably not for anybody here in this room. It's very deep tech and government focused. But if you ever just want to meet other new people and you're in Canberra, then I recommend reaching out to either Paul or Matt, his brother. They're just awesome people. Just a little call out from me. Here's my contact details if anybody wants to get in touch. I'm also probably the most easy to find cyber CEO in this country. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm everywhere. You can find me. It's no big deal. For those of you that are part of the Stone and Chalk family, you can catch me on Slack. I'm pretty bad on catching up on the Stone and Chalk Slack because my Slack is going off tap all the time, but I will get to you, I promise. Please reach out. Adam there, I'm not actually sure why I put his contact details up there, seeing as you haven't actually met him yet, but he's my co-founder. If you ever want to talk tech, he's your person. Thanks, everyone.